forecasters. Now, let me say, it's difficult enough to just forecast the economy in normal times. When you're talking about, global supply chains in turmoil, it's a whole different thing. And you're talking about a pandemic that's holding people out of the labor force for reasons that we can sample, but we don't have a lot of experience with this. So it's very, very difficult to forecast and not easy to set policy. So we have to set policy, though. So that's what we're doing. And, so to look at your question this way, I don't think that we're behind the curve. I actually believe that policy is well positioned to address the range of plausible outcomes. And that's what we need to do. I do think it would be premature to raise rates today. That's not, I don't think that's controversial. Certainly, I don't know anyone arguing for that today. And the reason is that there's still ground to cover to get to maximum employment. And we don't want to stop that when there's good reason to think. There's still good reason to think, although it's been delayed, clearly, there's good reason to think that the economy will reopen, particularly if we do get past, significant outbreaks of COVID. That's when we're really going to see what the characteristics of the labor market are. And, I think, the bottlenecks that we're seeing in global supply chains around goods and, frankly, now at our own domestic ports, because demand is stronger than the capacity of those ports, those things are going to work themselves out. We have a flexible economy. It'll take some time, but, the experts managed to create a vaccine faster than I expected. And I think this stuff will work itself out over the course of next year. That is my baseline understanding, and that's very widely held among people. But, we are prepared for different eventualities, and we will use our tools to achieve price stability and maximum employment. And we're going to let the data lead us to where we need to go. Our policy will adapt, and has already adapted, to the changing understanding of inflation and of bottlenecks and the whole supply side story, which is also partly a demand story. So our policy will continue to adapt as is appropriate.
Thank you. Let's go to Nancy Marshall-Genzer at Marketplace.
Hi, Chair Powell. Thanks for taking our questions. So you announced that the Fed is going to taper at a rate of starting at $15 billion a month, and that's more than twice the pace of the last taper. So why are you tapering faster this time?
The economy is in quite a different place than when we tapered back in, I guess it was 2013. We were much farther away from maximum employment. Inflation was much lower. This is an economy where demand is very, very strong, and job openings substantially exceed the number of unemployed people. So the need for further stimulus is far less than it was in 2013, where we still had quite a ways to go. I mean, after we began that taper, it was still many years before we reached what I would characterize as conditions consistent with maximum employment, let alone price stability. So this is quite a different situation, and the committee unanimously felt today that we had met the test that we'd articulated, and this was appropriate. And this is faster than what people had expected 6 months ago. It's earlier and faster, and that's because as I mentioned, our policy has been adapting to the situation as it evolves, as it's clarifying itself, and that's partly because we see inflation coming in higher.
Thank you. Let's go to Mike Derby.
Yeah, thank you for taking my question. I wonder if the Fed has given any thoughts yet to the end game for the balance sheet in terms of, once you get the taper process complete, will you hold the balance sheet steady, or will you allow it to start passively winding down? And then in a related question, do you have any greater insight into what Fed bond buying actually does for the economy in terms of its economic impact? Have you been able to, measure it or quantify it in any fashion? Because I'm sure there's often been questions about what is bond buying actually doing to help the economy.
Sure. So in terms of the balance sheet, those questions that you mentioned, we haven't gone back to them. Now that we've tapered, I expect that that's exactly what we'll do in coming meetings, and we'll do it in an orderly fashion. And we'll talk about reinvestment and all those things. And we don't have to make decisions on those yet. But typically when we're doing a new subject like that, we'll have a series of briefings and discussions and that's what we will now begin to do. In terms of the effect of asset purchases on the economy, so there's a tremendous amount of research and scholarship on this, and you can kind of you can find different people coming out with different views, but I would say the most mainstream view would be that you're at the effective lower bound. So how do you affect longer-term rates? There are two ways. One, so you can't lower rates. Let's say you can't lower rates any further, hypothetically. So you can give forward guidance. You can say we're going to keep the rates low for a period of time, either a specific period until certain conditions are met. The markets will do the math, and that'll have an effect on longer-term borrowings, even 10, 30 years out, kind of thing. So that's one thing. The other thing you can do is you just go buy those securities, buy longer-term securities. That will drive down longer-term rates and hold them lower. And rates right across the rate spectrum matter for borrowers. So lower rates encourage more borrowing, encourage more economic activity. People that you can service your debt, you have more free cash flow. It's not different from what we do at the short end. So that was discussed long before anybody did it. That was, I think, Milton Friedman said that was what you could do if you were pinned at the lower bound many years ago. So anyway, that's how it's supposed to work. And it's quite hard to be precise about these things because you only have one economy and you can't run two different economies right next to each other and do a scientific experiment. But most of the findings are that it does support economic activity in the way that you would expect, which is to say, at the margin, more economic activity with lower rates, which is why we do what we do. More accommodative financial conditions lead to more economic activity over time with a lag. So I think that's the main finding I would say on QE.
Thank you.
Thank you. We're going to go to Paul LaMonica at CNN.
Chair Powell, you've addressed already questions about the stock purchases that took place from some of the regional Fed presidents, and addressing the American people to make sure that they can trust the Fed. I was wondering also, in light of the fact that we now have questions about your own future, whether or not President Biden will nominate you for a second term, what would you say to the president and to senators that potentially will be voting on a renomination about this specifically with regards to your future as Fed chair for a possible second term?
So I will answer your question, Paul, but I'm not going to have any comment whatsoever on the renomination process at all. I will say, though, that I have briefed administration officials and I've briefed people on Capitol Hill in detail about what we did and why we did it, and seeking their feedback, getting their reaction. But this is part of my job. Congress has oversight over the Fed, and we take that very seriously. So if you're on our one of the two committees that has oversight over us, then I'm in regular contact with you probably. And when something like this comes up, I'm on the phone. I'm offering to meet with you and explain it to you and answer your questions and identify any concerns people might have. That's just part of my job. So I do that. I don't talk about particular conversations, but you can assume I'll always do that, and I certainly did it in this case.
Thank you.
Thank you. Let's go to Hannah Lang at the American Banker.
Hi, I wanted to ask about the supplementary leverage ratio. Is the Fed still planning on seeking comment on ways to permanently adjust that? And how concerned are you ultimately about banks' willingness to intermediate in the Treasury markets without a permanent fix?
So I don't have anything for you on supplemental leverage ratio right now. We are looking at ways to, if there are ways we can address liquidity issues through that channel. We also have there's a working group headed by Treasury about over Treasury markets and what happened in the acute phase of the pandemic and what structural things may need to be done. So that would be part of that work stream. And I know that there's a lot going on. I'm not sure when that report will be out, but so it's work underway. That's one of the many issues that are part of that, along with things like central clearing of treasuries, greater central clearing, and many other ideas. It's important that we have a liquid treasury market. It's a huge public benefit that we do, and I think we need to do those things that enable that, while also assuring safety and soundness of our largest financial institutions, who tend to be the main dealers. So we have to make sure that's always a first order concern as well.
Thank you.
Thank you. Let's go to Brian Chung at Yahoo Finance.
Hi, Chairman Powell. Brian Chung, Yahoo Finance. So just to expand on the ethics conversation, you talked about how you engaged with people on Capitol Hill and in the administration. You talked about what you've done already, but I'm just wondering if you could take a step back and just assess whether or not there was reputational damage as a result of that, either from the public's view or from the financial community's view of the Federal Reserve's independence. And then secondly, do you look back on the whole episode and have thoughts on your individual responsibility in preventing something like this from having happened?
So, I think it's too soon to say what the reputational damage is. I think from the very beginning, my reaction was we need to deal with this straightforwardly, transparently, and forcefully, and that's what we're going to do. I mean, it means everything to me that we do whatever it takes to make sure that nothing like this happens again. And I like to think we've made a real good start on that. If you think about it, you cannot execute a trade unless it's pre-cleared. And then you have to say execute. It's not even a trade. Really, there's no trading going on. This is for investment and getting liquidity for life's expenses. But you then have to wait 45 days to actually execute that sale or purchase. So I think it's a pretty good system. We'll always be looking to make it better. So in terms of our independence, Look, I think we will address this, and I think we have, and I like to think it's enough, but it's going to, we're just beginning to implement it. We have to write the rules, which we're doing, as quickly as possible. We need more people. We're going to have to resource this much more significantly here at the board, and also we're going to need appropriate technology because, the Fed has system has more than 30,000 employees. Not all of them. Far fewer of them will be covered by this, but the senior officers who will be covered by this will have to have technology access, and it's going to have to work efficiently. So there's a lot of work to do to implement it. Again, I would just say this system has been in place for decades, and it was in place when I took over. It was in place for at least the last 3 or 4 chairs, and it was what it was, and it proved to have weaknesses in it. And part of that was that it wasn't uniformly enforced across the system. I'm a big believer in the value of the Federal Reserve System and the reserve banks, but you had 12 different ethics officers at 12 different banks, and you had ethics people here, and compliance wasn't all exactly the same. It was a little bit different and uneven. And also the rules were, we didn't imagine the problems that happened, and they may have actually been, I don't know this, but they may actually have been in compliance with the specifics of our rules. They were clearly not in compliance with the part of our rules that said don't do anything that would create a bad appearance. I mean, that's clear. This was a bad appearance. So anyway, what can we do? We are where we are. It happened. And we just have to deal with it forthrightly and transparency and own it and step up to this, meet this moment. I'm totally committed to doing that. And again, if there are better ideas, I'd love to hear them. But I think we have so far made a good start.
When you say you spoke with administration officials, did that include the president?
I'm not going to answer who I spoke to at all. I'm not going to give you any names, so don't take that as a yes or no. I'm just not going to start down that road.
Okay, thank you. We're going to go to Jeff Cox for the last question.
Yeah, thank you. Chair, I just want to dig a little bit deeper on employment. We've seen what's been called the Great Resignation, with folks leaving their jobs in record numbers. Is there any feeling there that maybe you've been accused of fighting the last war, that perhaps the labor dynamics have changed in the post-COVID environment, and that full employment may not look like what it looked like before?
Yeah, so what's happening is people are leaving their jobs. They're quitting their jobs in all-time high numbers, but in many cases going back into employment and getting higher wages. So a lot of the higher wages you're seeing are for job switchers rather than incumbents. So that's a sign of a really strong labor market, as opposed to people just running off and quitting. There have also been there are a significant number of retirements, and we'll just have to see what that means. So toward the end of the last cycle, which was the longest in our recorded economic history, we did see labor force participation moving up well above what economists estimate was the trend. And part of that was people staying in the labor force older and just not retiring at the rates they were expected to retire. So maybe this was just catch up on that. I am a believer that over time, you won't know how far, you won't know what can happen with labor force participation in advance, and you're just going to have to give it some time, because we saw that over and over again. There are things that we can say, you know, this is where the limit is. Labor force participation is a much more flexible subject for me, and so I do think we need to be humble about what the limits are of labor force participation. But we expect labor force participation to pick up. We don't know the pace at which it will do so. So in terms of full employment, as I discussed earlier, I think at the very beginning of the recovery, the natural thing to do was to look back at labor market conditions in February of 2010 at the end of the longest expansion in our history. It was so much to like about that labor market, really historically good labor market, never perfect, but a good labor market. We're in a different world now. It's just very different. The pandemic recession was the deepest, and the recovery has been the fastest. And wages didn't really go down, and real incomes were more than fully replaced by fiscal policy. All of this is completely unusual. An economy where inflation was driven by services is now inflation where all the inflation is in goods, which have had negative inflation for a quarter century. So you ask about full employment, I think into the thought that it's going to be an empirical question of where it is located, and we're just going to learn more and more. I mean, one thing we'll learn, I hope we'll learn in the near term, is once the Delta variant really does continue to decline, what's going to happen to employment? Are we going to start to see over the winter, significant increases in jobs again? If you look back, the 3, 6, and 9-month average job creation is between 550,000 and 600,000. So if you think of that as a stronger, you don't have to think back to the million job months of June and July. You can just think, okay, 550 to 600. If we should get back on that path, then we would be making good progress. And we'd like to see that, of course. So we'll know so much more, and believe me, we understand. It's a different world in so many ways, and we're very open to that.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you all for joining us today.
Thank you.